Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Miesbauer, Content Manager at Agiloft. Welcome to today's training webinar titled Using and Modifying the Approvals Table, hosted by Agiloft Implementer Ryan Simmons. Today we will explain the basic concepts of using and modifying the approvals table, starting with some of the more basic concepts and then covering conditional approvals, modifying approval layouts, and linked sets. We will host a more advanced training on the approvals table later this spring, so be on the lookout for that. Presentation today will be about 44 minutes, followed by a live Q&A with Ryan. Please submit your questions in the appropriate window in the Zoom platform at any time during the presentation.
Hi, my name is Ryan Simmons. I am an implementer with Agiloft, and this is an introduction into using and modifying the approvals table. We will begin by creating, launching, and modifying approvals from the contracts table. That includes using ad hoc approvals and understanding the foundations of the approvals table. After that, we will create our own approval workflow. This will primarily involve two tables, approval workflows and approval templates. Towards the end, we will cover quick updates that can enhance your experience with these tables. Approvals provide the right information with the right presentation. With all the information we can store in Agiloft, specifically the contracts table, approvals provide power users everything they require to make a decision. Approvals are distinct records with a linked set of fields to a contract. However, we can still manage approvals from our contract record. From our contract record, we select the approval workflow, launch and recheck conditional approval templates, and edit our related table of approvals. This related table shows all the approvals linked to this contract. With the action bar, we can create a new ad hoc approval or start the process all over by relaunching from a particular approval. Let's get on our nifty spaceship to the knowledge base for a demonstration. We are now looking at the Approvals tab of a contract. Keep an eye on the workflow title when I update the contract type. It refreshes because approval workflows are dependent on contract types. Let's select the sample approval workflow and click the Create Approvals button. Now we have a related table in the Approvals Needed section. The approval process has not yet launched, and each approval record is in the queued status. We have 4 approval records sorted by step number. Curiously, we are missing step number 3. Step number 3 is a conditional approval based on the contract amount. Let's update the contract amount and recheck our conditional approvals. And we can now see the approval with the step number 3. The Recheck Conditional Approvals button is a great way to ensure the approval process is accurate. Next, imagine a special situation that requires an additional approval. We can add a new approval record by clicking New on the action bar. We will go through creating new approval records soon. Notice the step number of the new approval is 1.5. Step numbers can have decimals, which allows users to sandwich approvals between 2 existing steps. Additionally, 2 separate approvals may have the same step number. Those concurrent approvals will be pending simultaneously, and both must be approved before the next approval can be moved to pending. We are ready to launch the approval process. The Launch Approval Process button moves the contract status to pending approval, as well as the approval with the lowest step number. We are now looking at a contract that is pending approval. The first 2 approvals have been approved already, and the third approval is pending. Let's select step number 1 and resend for approval with the action bar. This action changes the approval record status to pending approval, but does not affect the rest of the workflow. This action will also move the contract to pending approval if that is not its current status. Now let's revert back to the same situation. Step 1 and 2 are approved. Let's select step number 1 and relaunch from this approval through the action bar. This action moves the record to pending approval and moves later approvals to queued. This action also moves the contract to pending approval if it is not its current status. That sums up managing approvals from a contract record. Now let's take a look at one of our existing approval records. Recall we have already launched our approval process, so the status is pending approval. The default status, which is the status the approval record is on creation, was queued. Notice the action buttons go away when I change the status. Action buttons and rules move approval records through the workflow, so we generally do not need to edit the status with this dropdown. Now, the approval title field is a concatenation of the approval template's title and the contract's title. This is an important field since it shows up in the related table from contracts. We will discuss setting approval titles from approval templates in the approval template section. Moving on to approval details, we discussed step numbers previously. They can hold decimals and they can have the same step number as another approval in the process. This approval is related to contracts. Approvals can be used for other tables as well, like documents and change requests. It is fairly common to implement an approval process for custom tables. If I know I will only work with contract approvals, I like to set this field to default to contracts. I will go over that in the tips and tricks section of this presentation. Approvals can be assigned to teams or individuals. To assign an approval to a team, simply leave the approver field blank. When an approver assigns to a team, everyone from that team receives a notification, and only one user needs to handle this approval record. If multiple users are required for one step, use multiple approval records with the same step number. Each approval record must be approved before moving on to the next step. The list of approvers is limited to those on the approval team selected. Assign the approver by updating the approval team field first. Auto approve bypasses the pending approval status and goes straight to approved. This is useful for simply sending notifications during the approval process. We will talk about notes in a second, but first, let's go through attachments. Here, we have no attachments available. However, the contract record does have an attachment. The attachment does not appear in the approval record because include in approval packet is set to no. We can quick edit this field to yes, and it will appear in our approvals record. Approvers can actually add attachments themselves by using the File field in this section. They can simply drag and drop a file into the File field. When I save this record after adding a file, the system will yell at me to add approval notes. I promised I would return to approval notes. An approver must add approval notes anytime they want to add a file, require changes, or permanently reject a record. Now let's save the record and see where our approval notes and our file go. We can see the approval running notes has the time-stamped message, and the file now appears under attachments. If we navigate to the Approval tab of the contract record, we can see the notes that the approver added. If we go to the Attachments tab, we can see the file as an attachment. The final header on the Approvals record is Contract Details. This section's purpose is to provide a concise amount of information for approvers. These fields are part of a link to the contract record. Later in this presentation, we will add and hide fields from this linked set. If the approver needs to view the contract itself, they can simply click on one of the hyperlinks. We will revisit the approvals table to update the layout linked set to contracts and email notifications in a later section of this presentation. Now, let's shift our focus to approval workflows. Approval workflows are simple records with only a few items to configure. They are essentially a series or schedule of approval templates. The most interesting aspect of approval workflows is the available for contract types field. An approval workflow for NDAs, for example, might not be relevant for another contract type. This field allows us to make that distinction. From contract type records, which we'll briefly dive into, you can even set a default approval workflow. The related table at the bottom of an approval workflow record consists of all of its approval templates. An approval workflow is essentially a series or schedule of approval templates. When you click Generate Approvals from Contract, the action actually goes through this approval workflow record on its way to the templates listed below. We often build and manage our approval templates through this related table. We can easily update the step number of existing templates or create a new template. Let's turn to approval templates, the blueprint for approvals. Approval template records look quite similar to approval records, but there are distinct differences. The approval usage field allows users to select whether an approval is required or conditional. We will revisit conditional approval templates soon, so for now we will stick to required. The Assign Approval Based On field has options approvals do not have: Person from Contract and Team from Contract. For this approval template, we would always like to assign it to the department head. However, the department head can change from contract to contract. With Assign Approval Based On, we can choose the Person from Contract value and select the variable we would like to use. This works the same way for Teams from Contracts. Without further ado, let's take a trip to the International Knowledge Base Station and build our own approval workflow. Here is our approval workflow record. Let's get started by setting related to contracts and coming up with our own workflow title. Notes is really just there for reference only. We can select which contract types this workflow will be available for. Let's go ahead and select all but 2. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a contract type record and set our workflow as its default. Here we are viewing the customer service contract type, and just like you can set a default print template title, we can set the default work title to the special workflow for presentation. Here we are looking at the approval workflow record, but what's an approval workflow without any approval templates? At the top of the approval template, we have the approval title field. Approval records take their title from this field and their contract title, so it's important to label this field clearly. Our workflow title is already there from the workflow we were just viewing. Moving to approval details, the approval usage field designates whether the approvals will be conditional or required. We will dive into conditional approvals a little bit later, so let's stick with required approvals for now. This is the first step of the process, so we will go ahead and set it as number 1. Auto Approve allows for notifications during the approval process without hindering the workflow. The final 2 fields work in conjunction. For this approval template, we want to assign the department head listed for the contract. This is classified as a person from the contract as it's a variable that updates from contract to contract. The Assign To list shows us a list of people from the contract we can choose from. We can also choose an approval based on a team from a contract. The Assign To field in this instance would show any teams associated with the contract instead of people. In both instances, the list of variables is pulled from the replacement variable table. We will add and remove variables later in this presentation. Sometimes we do not want to use a variable from the contract to assign an approval and instead designate a single user or team. For this, we can use assigned team/person, and then we can simply select the legal team in this example and select somebody from that team, or leave the approver field blank and everybody on the legal team will get a notification. Anyone from the legal team can handle approvals from this template. If each member of the team must approve, then create concurrent approvals with the same step number, and assign them individually to each team member. Now, let's add a new conditional approval template. We will set this up for the finance team by moving approval usage to conditional. The step number is step number 2, which makes this a concurrent approval. And we will start building a formula in the condition box with formula help. If the formula that we place in the condition field is true, then the approval template will generate. The first tab, the Home tab, will show us supported operators that we will use in our formula. The Fields tab is where we will actually select the variables to evaluate. Since we are evaluating fields from the contracts table, first select the latest contract ID link and then add contract variables. In this instance, we will select the contract amount and see if it is greater or equal than $100,000. The double ampersand signifies and, which means both conditions must be true. We will select the contract term in months and see if it's greater or equal to 18. And let's make sure we add in a condition description, which just puts what you added in plain English. And we will add somebody from the finance team as our approver. Let's go ahead and add an extra approval step to our workflow. This will be assigned to the contract requester's manager. We'll mark it as step number 3. Since the contract request manager can change from contract to contract, you will select person from contract and select the contract request manager variable. Now that we have a nice approval workflow, let's see it in action from the contracts table. I have a contract with every required field pre-filled except for the contract type. Let's select Customer Service Contract. The workflow title defaults to our special workflow for presentation because we set that up from the contract type earlier. Let's go ahead and create our approvals. Now we can see that only 3 of the 4 approvals from the workflow were generated. Let's view the conditional workflow and remind ourselves of what the condition is. The contract must be over $100,000 and the contract term must be over 18 months, which I went ahead and set in the background so that it's over 18 months, but there's no contract amount for this record. Let's go ahead and put $200,000 in, and we will recheck our conditional approvals. Now that we have everything finalized, it is time to launch our approval process. Let's take a look at our contract now that it's pending approval. The progress bar is 3/4 gray with one orange part for the pending approval. If we open that record up, this shows a lot of the information that we've already discussed. The approve required changes, permanently reject button. Enough information for us to make a nice decision, which for this one will be to approve the record. Now we have one gray section for our queued approval, two orange sections for the pending approvals, and one approved record, which shows up in our related table. Step 2 consists of concurrent approvals that assigned simultaneously. The first one is assigned to the legal team, so only one person from the team will need to update the record. We can tell because the approver field is null. The approver will receive a validation error if they attempt to require changes or permanently reject without updating approval notes first. When we require changes, normally it is the internal contract owner who reviews the contract. The status of the record is pending contract manager. The approval record itself moves to the requires changes status. If we select the record and click resend for approval, the approval will go back to pending approval, and the contract will also go to the pending approval status. Additionally, the notes added while requiring changes show up within the approval notes field from the contract. Now let's open up an approval record and take a look at attachments. Notice that this record does not show any attachments in this spot. However, when we go to the Attachments tab of the contract and scroll down, there is an attachment record. This attachment does not show up in the approval because include in approval packet is set to no. This can be quick edited to yes, and a quick refreshing of the approval record will now include this attachment. Approvers can add files of their own with the Approver Updated Files field and adding approval notes. When they save, the file will show up under Attachments, and it will be linked to the contract as well. Finally, while approving this record, remember that step number 3 will not move to pending approval until both step number 2s are taken care of. Let's take a look at the difference between resend for approval and relaunch from this approval. If we select step number 1 and resend for approval, only step number 1 will be affected. As you can see here, the rest remain approved. If we select the first approval and relaunch from this approval, the following records will move to queued. Remember this, so approvers do not have to reapprove unless absolutely necessary. Finally, when the last approval moves to approved and John Steinbach says, "Thou mayest," the contract will move to the approved status. That wraps up the basics of creating an approval workflow, launching the approval process, and managing approvals
from a contract record. The next section consists of common updates made to the approval process. This includes updating fields that appear in approval records in the contract details section. Throughout the approvals, approval templates, and approval workflows tables, there are several choice fields called related to. If approvals are only used for contracts, it may save time to default these fields to contract. Approval templates can assign to a person or team from contract. This list of options comes from the replacement variables table. We will add a replacement variable of our own. Finally, even seasoned Agiloft implementers check their conditional approval templates. Creating a few fields and using an action makes troubleshooting a breeze. Approval records provide a concise set of information in the contract details section. This information is part of a link to selected fields from the contracts table. Update these fields in the Setup menu of Approvals by going to the Fields tab and editing the linked set. Once the linked field set is updated, navigate to the Layout tab to reorganize the fields. Before going through this process of adding fields, consider whether this will save the approver time. It is not necessary for the approver to see every detail about the contract from the approval record. Approvers can click on one of the hyperlinked fields, like contract title or contract amount, to open the contract record itself. The most detailed approval record may not be the most efficient approval record. So let's go to the Setup menu for the Approvals table and navigate to the Fields tab. Scroll down to the linked fields to the contract record and navigate to the Fields tab, which is the third one on the top. The field name column on the left is the name of the field in the contract table. On the right is the field name in the approvals table. Let's go ahead and add the contract end date. The best practice is to prepend the source table's name to the field name for the sake of clarity. For example, instead of using department head, use contract department head. This clarifies that this field is part of the linked set and referencing the contract itself. Navigate to the top to go to the Display tab, where you can select the input field for each field in the linked set. When adding to a pre-existing linked set, the best options are to use Hyperlinked View Only or Plain Text View Only. View the examples in the bottom left corner if you would like, and click Finish when done. After the field is added, navigate to the Layout tab to reorganize how the fields appear on approval records. The update will take place on the Details tab. Click and drag the field to add. Consider how the fields will look on the layout and try to organize in a way that flows naturally. In this instance, it makes sense for the contract's start and end dates to be next to each other. Click Preview to view the layout without saving the updates. If everything looks good, go ahead and close out of the preview and click Finish at the top or bottom of the Layout tab. Go ahead and take a look at one of the approval records now. We can see the contract end date is there and everything looks pretty nice. Remember that these are hyperlinks that can be clicked,
and they will open up the contract record. So it is not necessary to have every single field on this approval record layout. Not all links are links to the contract record. Some, like the company name, links to the company record. If users do not need this hyperlink, feel free to change the display input aid to plain view only. The approvals, approval templates, and approval workflows table all use a related to field. Approvals are used in several tables in the out-of-the-box system and can be added to other tables as well. If only the contracts table utilizes approval processes, defaulting these related to fields to the contracts option can save time. To make this update, go back to the Fields tab of the Setup menu for each table and update the default value for each choice field. In the Approval Workflows table, we can go to Setup Approval Workflows, navigate to the Fields tab, scroll down to the Related to field. To set the default for this choice field, simply go to the Options tab at the top or click Next to get there. Scroll down to the select the default value to display and click Finish. Now create a new approval workflow and see that related to will default to contracts. The process is the same for each table. Replacement variables are used by approval templates to assign approval records for contracts as well as other tables. The list value of the replacement variable appears in the approval template through a link to selected fields. This is displayed on the left. The variable chain that we actually use in the replacement variable record needs to start from the approval record. In this example, the variable chain goes through the contract ID and pulls that contract's internal contract owner. Navigate to the replacement variables table, which is normally under the system subheading, and click New to create a new replacement variable. Related to, let's select contracts, leave used in fields B, and in this instance we will use person from contract, although we can also use this to select a team from contract. The next step is to add the variable. Since this variable chain starts at the approval record, the Formula Help button will not help us here. Since the variable chain starts in the approvals table, let's go to the setup menu for the approvals table and find the field variable that we want to start the chain. In this instance, it is the contract ID, since we are going through the contract ID linked set. Be sure to add your $sign here at the beginning. Then we will use a period to separate the variables. Go to the Fields tab of the contract table and select our second variable. When assigning to an individual, be sure to use the ID field to match with their employee record. Now that everything looks good, let's save and add this to an approval template. Let's add an approval template to the existing approval workflow that we were working on earlier and go ahead and call this Special Contract Review. Assign the approval based on the person from the contract, which was set by the replacement variable earlier, and select the list value that we entered and save. With this updated approval workflow, let's take a look at a pre-filled contract with John Steinbeck as the special contract approver. Click Create Approvals, and now for the moment of truth, let's take a look at that
approval that we just created the template for. And there it is. Step number 4, special contract review assigned to John Steinbeck. And that wraps up replacement variables. Conditional approval templates require testing before put into a live system. Even advanced users troubleshoot conditional approval templates. Conditional approval templates require a little bit of testing before using in a live setting. Even advanced users troubleshoot conditional approval templates. With a simple action button and text field, users can check the condition on the fly without even saving the approval template. Conditional approval templates go through the link to the latest contract ID. This field is on the History tab in the out-of-the-box setup, but it cannot be edited due to its input aid. We will update that setting as well. After we make those updates, we will build some conditional approval templates and troubleshoot the conditions. First, take a look at the out-of-the-box setup. The condition is up here on the Details tab. You have to go to the History tab to actually see the latest contract ID, which is a hyperlink view only, and the conditional value, which will update when the approval template saves. If you make an update to our approval template, like add a 0 in here, the condition value will not update until we save the record. Let's go ahead and close our history and open up background fields, and we can see the update takes place now. So let's get out of this approval template and go into the setup menu for the approval templates table. Navigate to the Fields tab. Create a text field called Condition Check. Remember to add some approval notes. There is no need to go into the Options or the Permissions tabs. Update the width of the input field to something small like 15 or 10, since the only value it will display is true or false. Next, create an action button called Condition Check. It is very important to run this action button without saving. We are going to add an update action and call it something simple like Condition Check. This action updates the Condition Check text field with the variable for the condition itself. We are updating the text box with a formula and overriding the existing value. Let's click Finish. Make sure that we once again add approval notes. We should update the Display tab for our action button standards, which means displaying neither the label nor input instruction and left justifying. Next, go to the latest contract ID field. Navigate to the Display tab and update the input aid with hyperlink box with lookup. This allows us to change the latest contract ID within the approval templates record. Navigate to the Layout tab and move fields to the Details tab. During testing, it can be helpful to move latest contract ID to the Details tab as well. Let's take a look at our new functionality in action by going to an approval template, making updates to the condition, and clicking Condition Check. Notice that the condition check will update from true and false depending on the condition. And if we were to cancel and reopen, the condition reverts back to the original formula. Let's take a look at some simple updates to conditions. Remember that formula help will show us the first thing that we'll look at, which is the operators. The most simple one is the difference between and or, which we have here.
In this instance, both of these must be true since it's an AND statement. If we add an extra 0 and check the condition, because both are not true, it will be false, and this is the contract itself that we're using, the latest contract ID. That is 800,000. If we instead switch this to OR and checked our condition, it would then be true. Next, we are going to combine statements using parentheses. You're going to pull the renewal type from the latest contract ID and set it equal to evergreen. The statement within the parentheses will read, the latest contract amount must be greater than $100,000, or the renewal type must equal evergreen. This functionality allows us to pick one or the other within the parentheses, but use the AND condition after the parentheses, and our condition for this is true. It's important in troubleshooting to make sure that choice lists and things like evergreen are spelled correctly. So I'm going to change the contract amount and switch the conditions to see if the condition is indeed still true, and it is. For the next example, I am going to quickly update the contract so the renewal type is no longer evergreen and the first statement is not true. Formula help tells us that the exclamation point is the operator for the is not function. The most reliable way to use is not is to place the exclamation point before the parentheses. When we do this, we can see that the condition check is true. As always, it is a good rule to switch the conditions to be the opposite of what we just assigned and run the condition against the new values. The next use case comes up quite regularly. In this instance, we do not want the approver to get an approval for a contract that they requested. Let's take the requester's ID from the latest contract ID, and let's make sure that it is not equal to the approver ID. The approver in the template is Ryan Simmons, and that is also the requester name. So if we check this condition, it will return false. If we change the approver and check it again, it returns true. Next, we will look at consolidating and simplifying conditions. This is a different conditional approval template. It is checking whether one of 4 departments are being used and if the contract type is one of several predetermined contract types. It is quite difficult to know which department is which from this angle unless we know the Agiloft IDs off the top of our heads. Additionally, if an update is made at the department level, a user will have to go into each approval template that is designed like this and update it. A more efficient way of handling this is to create a simple field within the department and contract types tables. In this instance, we will call it Special Approval Required, and we will update the linked set from contracts to department to include this field. Now all of these department fields can be replaced by using that variable and checking if it is equal to yes. I designed a similar field for contract types, which I already had lined up and ready to go. So I'm quickly going to remove those fields as well. And we can see that this is a much simpler and more streamlined condition. And once again, we can update whether or not a department is included by toggling that special field. That wraps up the introduction into using and modifying the approvals table. Thank you for watching. I'm Ryan Simmons.
All right, now we'll open it up for Q&A with Ryan. We've got a question here. when would I assign an individual from the contract as an approver?
Great. So this question really comes down to whether you want to assign something to a person, a designated person every time. So maybe you have somebody in your legal department who needs to see every contract. You can just put their name in that spot. But I want to make sure that you're asking yourself, does this person vary from department to department? So if it is going to be the department head of legal needs to see it, if the contract is for legal, or the department head for finance needs to see it, if the department of the contract is finance. In that case, you would actually want to use one of those replacement variables that we talked about in the recording, and use a variable instead of assigning it to a specific person.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. We got another question here. How do you decide to use one approval workflow or multiple approval workflows?
Right, great. So this feeds, or the last question feeds into this question actually. So a lot of times I have customers who say, we want to have one approval workflow for this department, one approval workflow for this other department, or maybe it's by contract type. But you want to keep an eye on certain things, like can we use a variable from the contract to consolidate it to one workflow? We saw with the example towards the end where I was able to take this attribute and assign it at the department level. You should really consider if there's something in common with these variables, that with these different situations that we can build something out to handle and use one consolidated workflow. But of course, there are situations where one workflow, no matter how flexible it is, will work, and you want to have different workflows for each time. So the first thing is see if you can make it one consolidated workflow. It's much easier to work with. It's much easier to update. And then if you can't do it, go ahead and build out different approval workflows.
Great. So here's one. When would I use concurrent approvals or just assign to a team?
Great. So when you assign an approval to a team, only one person from that team needs to handle that approval. So if you need to have 4 people from one team approve it, that means 4 people need to click on it. Then you are going to create 4 different approvals assigned to those individual. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you assign it to a team, only one person needs to click on it. If you assign it to all 4 individuals concurrently, then they will all have to approve it. And that will show up if you have to audit the approval process later on.
Great. And what about auto approve? When do you use an auto approve?
Great. So auto approve is not used too often in my experience, but it is something that is helpful to give somebody a notification during the approval process. They won't necessarily have to approve they won't have to log into the system or really take any action, but it does keep them abreast of the situation.
Great. And if we missed anything today, or you have other more advanced approval questions, please let us know. We will, as I said, we will be doing a more advanced training later this spring. So let us know either in the Q&A, or you can email us at news@agiloft.com, and we will be sure to cover those in the next training. I believe Ryan has also prepared a handout, a little handy sheet that we're going to include with the follow-up email to this webinar, which will also include the slides and the recording. So check your inboxes for that in 24 to 48 hours. I want to also say that if you have any questions about Agiloft approvals or any other kind of admin configuration questions, you can always go to the community at community.agiloft.com and submit your question there, and implementers and our partners and anyone as a part of the community who can chime in on and try to answer your questions there.
Great. And can I just add to this, if you allow me to rudely interrupt you? This training was really designed to have in your back pocket for if you're going to be working with approvals later on. This probably covers about 90% of anything that you would be doing with approvals. And it can be just something you refer to later that sparks ideas that you might have. So even if you didn't pick up everything today, it's a good thing just to have in your back pocket and bookmark for later on.
Great. Yeah, and that's why we do these, and that's why we make sure to archive all these on our YouTube channel, and try to remind everyone that these resources are available. So yeah, thanks a lot, Ryan, for your time producing this one, and we'll talk to you again for the advanced coming up. If you enjoyed this session, please check out our full webinar series on our website at agiloft.com. Next week, we'll be talking with Young's Holdings and World Commerce and Contracting on the 5 ways to avoid CLM implementation disaster. That'll be a great one. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.